Hey everyone! A few weeks ago, I watched the film American Psycho for the first time. Yes, I know, I'm almost 25 years late to the party. But since then, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that we should talk about the movie. The film American Psycho from 2000, based on the controversial novel by Bret Easton Ellis, is a satirical psychological thriller that addresses the emptiness and decadence of the yuppie culture of the 1980s. The term yuppie is an acronym and stands for the English Young Urban Professional, referring to young adults of the urban upper middle class or young, career-oriented, metropolitan people. Directed by Mary Harron, Christian Bale delivers a remarkable performance in the role of Patrick Bateman, blending the facade of a successful businessman with the dark psyche of a brutal serial killer. But what is the film actually about? Patrick Bateman lives in New York City and, at first glance, embodies the epitome of the successful young investment banker. He is rich, attractive, and possesses a seemingly flawless lifestyle. Bateman dresses in expensive designer suits, maintains a strict skincare and fitness routine, and visits exclusive restaurants and clubs with his colleagues. But already in the first scenes of the film, it becomes clear that Bateman is dominated by inner emptiness and deep emotional coldness beneath his shiny surface. The world in which Bateman moves is characterized by materialism and superficiality. His colleagues, also bankers, are just as narcissistic and status-obsessed as he is. They measure their worth by business cards, reservations at the trendiest restaurants, and brand-name items. Relationships, both romantic and professional, are characterized by indifference and selfishness. Thus, Bateman treats his fiancée Evelyn, played by Reese Witherspoon, with contempt and indifference, even though they present a glamorous couple in public. But behind Bateman's flawless facade lurks a cruel, psychopathic personality. Early in the film, his dark side is hinted at when he abruptly ends a seemingly harmless conversation with a colleague, only to reveal that he has murder fantasies in his thoughts. The viewer learns that Bateman has a compulsion for violence, which he unleashes on the weakest members of society, the homeless, prostitutes, and sometimes even his acquaintances. His first major murder shown in the film is of a homeless man named Al. Bateman initially offers Al seemingly friendly help, but then he suddenly stabs him brutally and crushes the man's dog. This scene marks the beginning of a series of violent acts that span the entire film and become increasingly bizarre and brutal. A central moment in the film is Bateman's interaction with his colleague Paul Allen, played by Jared Leto. Allen is, in Bateman's eyes, a rival who outshines him with his luxurious lifestyle and apparent superiority. Especially Allen's business card, an important status symbol in their world, triggers envy and anger in Bateman. Bateman lures Allen to his apartment under the pretense of a shared dinner, where he bludgeons him to death with an axe. Meanwhile, Bateman's favorite song, Hip to Be Square by Huey Lewis and the News, plays in the background. The scene is both shocking and grotesquely comedic, highlighting the absurdity and dark humor of the film. Bateman disposes of Allen's body and then assumes his identity to commit further crimes. As the film progresses, Bateman's behavior becomes increasingly unpredictable. He brings a prostitute named Christy and another woman to his apartment, under the pretense of having an exciting evening. The evening, however, ends in sadistic violence as Bateman initially manipulates the women and then brutally attacks them. Christy is initially able to escape, but later is pursued and killed by Bateman in a murderous rage. His murders become increasingly grotesque and bloody, and Bateman is losing control over his facade. At the same time, his paranoia increases. He believes that people see through him, even though those around him ignore or do not take his psychopathic traits seriously. In a particularly disturbing scene, Bateman confesses to his secretary Jean, played by Chloe Sevigny, about his murders, but she does not take him seriously. This indifference of his surroundings reflects the moral decay of the world in which Bateman lives. The plot reaches its climax when Bateman descends into a complete psychotic breakdown during one night. In a blood frenzy, he shoots several people, including a security guard and a police officer, and leads a wild chase through the streets of Manhattan. Finally, he calls his lawyer Harold Carnes and leaves him a desperate message confessing to all his murders, including the murder of Paul Allen. The next day, Bateman meets with his lawyer to confront him with the confession. But to Bateman's surprise, Carnes doesn't even recognize him and explains that his supposed victim, Paul Allen, is still alive. This meeting raises an important question: did Bateman's actions actually happen, or are they merely the product of his imagination? The film deliberately leaves this question open and blurs the line between reality and delusion. At the end of the film, Bateman is again sitting with his colleagues in a restaurant. Despite his confession, he remains undiscovered, and his life goes on as if nothing had happened. In his inner monologue, Bateman reveals his despair. He realizes that he cannot find redemption because the society he lives in allows for no consequences. His life remains superficial and empty, and his actions, whether real or imagined, have no meaning. Patrick Bateman is an attractive, wealthy, and extremely well-groomed man in his late 20s. As an investment banker, he works on Wall Street, making him part of the elite New York yuppie culture. His appearance is flawless, underscored by his meticulous daily grooming routine. At the beginning of the film, he describes how he treats his body and face with a range of expensive skincare products and trains for hours in the gym to stay in perfect physical condition. His clothing consists exclusively of designer suits, and his daily life is characterized by an obsessive pursuit of perfection. He measures himself against his colleagues through superficial status symbols such as the quality of their business cards, reservations at exclusive restaurants, and brand name items. This superficiality is a central aspect of his character. For Bateman, only the outward appearance matters, while the inner substance is completely neglected. Behind the smooth facade lies a deeply disturbed personality. Bateman suffers from a profound inner emptiness that drives him to commit extreme acts of violence to feel some form of emotion or meaning in his life. He is a narcissist who only cares about his own needs and feels no empathy for others. His emotional coldness is evident both in his relationships and in his actions. He does not see his fiancée Evelyn as an independent person, but merely as an accessory that underscores his status. He feels no affection for her and openly cheats on her. He behaves similarly towards his secretary Jean, who admires him and shows genuine interest in him. Although Bateman almost kills her at one point, he ultimately lets her go, which could indicate that he is deeply struggling with feelings of guilt, or that he simply does not consider her a worthy victim. Bateman's social group consists of indifferent and superficial people who are just as materialistic and status-obsessed as he is. He feels neither affection nor respect for them and instead often experiences contempt, as with Paul Allen, whom he perceives as a rival. His disdain for his friends and colleagues reflects his deep misogyny and class contempt. A central theme of his character is his inner emptiness. Bateman is a man without a true identity. He describes himself as pure nothingness, devoid of any real human feelings or beliefs. His obsessive pursuit of status and outward perfection is a desperate attempt to fill this emptiness. But all his efforts remain meaningless, and his actions seem to drive him further into isolation and madness. The acts of violence that Bateman commits can be interpreted in two ways, as real actions or as projections of his deep-seated psychological disorders. Whether they actually take place or only exist in his mind remains deliberately vague, but in both cases, they serve as a vent for his inner despair and his hatred of the world. His victims are often people he perceives as either weak or a threat to his status, such as homeless individuals, prostitutes, or successful colleagues. As the film progresses, Bateman's facade crumbles more and more, and his mental state deteriorates rapidly. He begins to become paranoid, and his ability to distinguish between reality and delusion diminishes. This culminates in a scene where he believes he is being pursued by the police and has an emotional breakdown, confessing all his murders to his lawyer. But even in that moment, he remains trapped. The people around him do not take him seriously, and his confession is dismissed as a joke. This intensifies his existential crisis and underscores the indifference of the world in which he lives. So Patrick Bateman is more than just a serial killer, he is a metaphor for the alienated, morally decayed society of the 1980s. His obsession with appearances, his complete lack of empathy, and his pursuit of power and control reflect the values of an era marked by materialism and selfishness. At the same time, he is a tragic character who is aware of his own emptiness but is unable to escape this condition. The title of the film implies that Patrick Bateman is a true psychopath. But is that sustainable from a psychiatric perspective? I would like to clarify this question with you today. From a psychiatric perspective, the term psychopath is traditionally used to describe a person characterized by specific traits in thinking, behavior, and emotional experience. The term originates from criminal psychology and is often mentioned in connection with antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, as well as dissocial personality disorder. However, psychopathy is not an official diagnostic criterion in the common classification systems such as the DSM-5 or the ICD-11. Studies have shown that psychopaths exhibit specific differences in the function of their brains. The amygdala, a part of the brain responsible for processing emotions such as fear or empathy, often shows reduced activity in psychopaths. Also, areas of the prefrontal cortex, which are responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and moral judgment, often work less effectively in psychopaths. At this point, an important note: not all psychopaths are criminals. Some find themselves in highly competitive professional fields, e.g., business, politics, where they can successfully utilize their manipulative and fearless traits. However, their behavior can be problematic for interpersonal relationships. In psychiatric practice, the term psychopath is used less frequently because it is stigmatizing and does not fit the diagnostic criteria. Instead, reference is often made to antisocial personality disorder or specific symptoms. The Psychopathy Checklist-Revised, PCL-R, by Robert D. Hare is a diagnostic tool used to assess psychopathy. It consists of 20 items, each measuring specific personality traits and behaviors associated with psychopathy. Each item is rated on a scale from 0 to 2. 0 means the characteristic does not apply. 1 means the characteristic partially applies, or in some situations. 2 means the characteristic is clearly and consistently applicable. A maximum score of 40 is possible, with a value of 30 or higher typically considered an indication of psychopathy. I now present to you a list of these 20 items and explain how I evaluated them. 1. Glibness/superficial charm. Psychopaths appear charismatic, eloquent, and self-assured, often excessively charming. This charm is not authentic, but a facade to manipulate others or gain their trust. I would rate this item a 2. Bateman is very charming and possesses the ability to manipulate and impress people. His charm, however, is purely superficial and serves to deceive others. 2. Grandiose sense of self-worth. They have an inflated self-image and consider themselves exceptionally important, talented, or irreplaceable. Criticism or failure is often ignored or dismissed. I would rate this item a 2. He sees himself as superior, both intellectually and socially, and considers other people as inferior. His narcissistic self-image is clearly shown in the film. 3. Need for stimulation/proneness to boredom. They constantly seek new and exciting experiences because they get bored easily. This often leads to impulsive or risky behavior, such as drug abuse or criminal activities. I would rate this item a 2. Bateman is easily bored and constantly seeks extreme forms of entertainment, whether in violence, drug use, or promiscuous behavior. His actions often serve to compensate for his inner emptiness. 4. Pathological lying. Lying is an integral part of their behavior, often without regard for consequences. They lie not only out of necessity but also to demonstrate power or control. I would rate this item a 2. He constantly lies to hide his double life and regularly invents stories to deceive others. His lying is manipulative and calculated. 5. Deceptive/manipulative. They deliberately exploit others to gain personal advantages. Manipulation can be subtle or direct and ranges from emotional exploitation to complex fraud schemes. I would rate this item a 2. Bateman deliberately manipulates people to carry out his acts of violence. He lures victims into his apartment by making them believe he is harmless or friendly. 6. Lack of remorse or guilt. They feel no remorse for harmful or unethical behavior. Even after serious offenses, they often see themselves as victims or justify their actions. I would rate this item a 2. He shows no remorse or guilt for his violent acts. Even in his confession, he feels no genuine remorse, but uses it to attract attention. 7. Shallow affect. Their feelings seem shallow, inauthentic, or superficial. They can feign emotions to influence others, but they do not feel them deeply. I would rate this item a 2. Bateman shows no genuine or deep emotions. His reactions to people and events are emotionless or feigned, indicating his emotional emptiness. 8. Callous/lack of empathy. They show no genuine concern for the feelings or suffering of others. People are often treated like objects, used or discarded at will. I would rate this item a 2. He feels no compassion for others, either for his victims nor for his close acquaintances. People are merely objects to him. 9. Parasitic lifestyle. They live at the expense of others, whether financially, emotionally, or socially. Instead of taking responsibility independently, they rely on manipulation and exploitation. I would rate this item a 1. Bateman lives off the privileges of Wall Street culture. Moreover, he openly cheats on his fiancée and expects her to accept it. He does work, but his existence is characterized by superficial consumer behavior. 10. Poor behavioral controls. They show difficulties in controlling their anger, aggression, or impulses. This often leads to impulsive outbursts that do not fit the social context. I would rate this item a 2. He often loses control over his anger or violent impulses, leading to sudden and extreme acts of violence. His reactions to frustration are unpredictable. 11. Promiscuous sexual behavior. You have numerous, often meaningless sexual relationships. Relationships are mostly based on manipulation or the satisfaction of short-term needs. I would rate this item a 2. He has numerous sexual relationships, particularly with prostitutes, and his sexuality is often associated with violence and power fantasies. 12. Early behavior problems. Serious behavioral problems, such as lying, stealing, aggression, or animal cruelty, can already be observed in childhood. These problems are often precursors to later antisocial behavior. I would rate this item a 0. In the film or novel, there are no indications of problematic behavior in his childhood or youth. 13. Lack of realistic, long-term goals. They have no concrete plans or perspectives for the future. Instead, they pursue impulsive, short-term ideas without foresight. I would rate this item a 2. Bateman has no meaningful long-term goals. His life revolves around short-term gratification and superficial status symbols. 14. Impulsivity. Decisions are made without thinking about the consequences. This often leads to irresponsible behavior, such as sudden job changes, criminal acts, or abrupt relationship endings. I would rate this item a 2. He often acts without thinking and commits murders or other crimes spontaneously and without a plan. 15. Irresponsibility. They do not take responsibility for their actions or duties. Obligations such as work, family, or financial tasks are often ignored or rejected. I would rate this item a 2. He takes no responsibility for his behavior, whether in personal relationships, at work, or for his crimes. 16. Failure to accept responsibility for own actions. They deny or minimize their role in problems and shift the blame to others. Often, justifications or excuses are used to absolve oneself. I would rate this item a 2. Even if he confesses, he expects no consequences and shows no willingness to take responsibility for his behavior. 17. Many short-term marital relationships. They have a history of unstable, short-lived relationships, marked by manipulation and a lack of attachment. This is evident in frequently changing partners or short marriages. I would rate this item a 1. Although he is not married, he shows a pattern of superficial and short-term relationships, particularly with his fiancée Evelyn and other women around him. 18. Juvenile delinquency. Even in their youth, they are involved in serious crimes such as theft, violence, or drug abuse. This behavior is often a precursor to later criminal activity. I would rate this item with a 0. There are no indications of criminal behavior or misconduct in his youth. 19. Revocation of conditional release. They fail to comply with probation conditions or other legal requirements. This shows their tendency to disregard rules and authorities. I would rate this item a 0. Since Bateman was never convicted, this criterion is not applicable. 20. Criminal versatility. They commit a variety of different crimes without limiting themselves to a specific type of crime. Examples range from fraud and theft to violence and serious crime. I would rate this item a 2. He commits a variety of crimes, including murder, torture, sexual violence, and cruelty to animals, which underscores his criminal versatility. With a total of 32 points, Patrick Bateman is clearly above the threshold of 30 points typically used to diagnose psychopathy. His personality is a classic example of extreme psychopathy, particularly in terms of emotional coldness, manipulation, impulsivity, and the absence of any remorse or empathy. His criminal versatility, inflated self-esteem, and superficial charm make him an archetypal psychopath. Bateman's characterization invites numerous interpretations and makes him one of the most fascinating and disturbing figures in modern literature and cinema. Even if the plot of American Psycho is interpreted as Patrick Bateman merely imagining his acts of violence and never actually committing them, he can still be considered a psychopath in the psychiatric sense. This is because psychopathy does not necessarily depend on the actual commission of crimes, but rather on the underlying personality traits and behaviors. Psychopathy is considered a severe personality disorder characterized by specific traits such as lack of empathy, emotional coldness, narcissism, and manipulation. These characteristics are independent of whether the person actually commits crimes. Bateman clearly exhibits many of these traits in the film and novel, even though the violent acts exist only in his imagination. Psychopathy is often characterized by a rich fantasy world in which the affected person lives out their inner desires and drives, even if these are not always realized in reality. Patrick Bateman might be imagining the murders to satisfy his fantasies of power and violence. This does not make him any less psychopathic, but rather underscores his inability to cope with his inner emptiness and his need for dominance. The PCL-R and other diagnostic systems assess personality traits and not necessarily the commission of crimes. A person can exhibit psychopathic traits without ever having committed a crime. Bateman's fantasies, his manipulative behavior, his lack of empathy, and his emotional coldness are enough to classify him as a psychopath. If the interpretation of the plot concludes that Bateman is imagining everything, additional diagnoses could be considered, such as narcissistic personality disorder with psychotic episodes. His violent fantasies and the possible inability to distinguish between reality and fiction could also indicate a psychotic disorder. Nevertheless, he would remain a psychopath due to his personality structure, as his core characteristics continue to dominate.